In early 1967, 20th Century Fox hired Akira Kurosawa to co-direct Tora, Tora, Tora. The film would be one of the largest in the studio's history, recreating with painstaking historical accuracy events surrounding the attack on Pearl Harbor. The story would be told from both American and Japanese perspectives, with simultaneous productions taking place in each country. Kurosawa, a celebrated cinematic titan, then working at the height of his powers, was going to lend the Japanese half. It was meant to be the first of several high-profile Hollywood productions. An important director seemed on the cusp of a tremendous career expansion. It all fell apart when personal and professional misfortune dismantled Kurosawa's reputation and nearly destroyed his ability to make films. This period would culminate in an emotional spiral that led to one of cinema's greatest artists attempting to take his own life. Akira Kurosawa, for Western viewers at least, is probably the most influential Japanese director of the last century. His film career begins in 1936, when he applied for a job, essentially on a whim, at a prominent studio, Toho, then known as PCL, or Photochemical Laboratories. He was hired as an assistant director, and it was under the mentorship of the generous Kajiro Yamamoto that Kurosawa fell in love with the filmmaking process. He ascended quickly through the ranks, alongside contemporaries like Ishiro Honda, the man who would go on to create Godzilla and mastermind dozens of subsequent monster movies. Kurosawa worked obsessively to master every aspect of film production, taking on editing in addition to his assistant director duties, and writing original screenplays in his spare time. In the span of only a few years, he became Yamamoto's most trusted and brilliant pupil. By 1943, he was graduating to the director's chair. His first film, Sanshiro Sugata, was a popular success, but options were limited in the war years. Government censors put heavy restrictions on the content acceptable for screenplays, so Kurosawa's early films were a bit inconsistent. His second movie, titled The Most Beautiful, is extremely well made, despite being little more than a wartime propaganda film. Sanshiro Sugata Part 2 lacked the inspiration of the first, and The Men Who Tread on the Tiger's Tail, produced in the final year of World War II, was made under such severe lack of resources that Kurosawa had to construct it around a single set, and the completed movie only ran 59 minutes. It wasn't much easier after the war ended. Japan was in ruins, and the American occupation came with its own censors, who also put many restrictions on content. Kurosawa struggled to tell stories of personal meaning. No Regrets for Our Youth and One Wonderful Sunday both showcase Kurosawa's increasing ambitions and growing talents, with One Wonderful Sunday especially being a remarkable document of post-war Japan. But these movies do lack a certain spark, that special element that makes the director's best work leap off the screen. That spark finally arrived when Kurosawa started working with Toshiro Mifune. Their first movie together, Drunken Angel, was a revelation. By then, Kurosawa was sick of listening to the censors and pushed himself to make exactly the kind of film he wanted. Drunken Angel took place in an abject slum, filled with pitiful characters just trying to survive. The superlative Takeshi Shimura, Kurosawa's other great star, plays an alcoholic doctor treating a tough, low-ranking gangster for tuberculosis, and angrily attempting to reform the young man's life through his blunt honesty. Mifune played the gangster, and he managed to steal the whole movie from the much more experienced Shimura. Here was an actor unlike any previously seen on Japanese movie screens, unmannered, without professional training, and taking his own instinctual emotions as the basis for his characters. He was fierce, volatile, yet deeply vulnerable at the same time. The rawness of his acting style captivated the director, and Kurosawa would build most of his next 16 films, made over a 17-year period, around Mifune, whose range seemed limitless. In 1950, they released Rashomon, an enormously innovative tale built around a complex flashback structure designed to provocatively question the nature of subjectivity and truth. A bandit has been arrested for the murder of a samurai, and during his trial, 3 separate testimonies are heard, each introducing more inconsistencies and contradictions, leaving us with no conclusive resolution. The film baffled many viewers in Japan, but won the Golden Lion at the Venice Film Festival and earned tremendous praise internationally. Arguably, Rashomon did more to introduce Western audiences to Japanese cinema than any other single film. It made Kurosawa a worldwide celebrity, and the prestige that came with this status allowed him to become probably the most powerful filmmaker in Japan. Kurosawa directed a succession of masterpieces, epic films noted as much for their expensive and lengthy productions as they were for their artistry and vision. Kurosawa became a legendary perfectionist, pushing collaborators and even himself, sometimes to the point of total exhaustion, but his unwavering commitment to his art often inspired those around him to deliver their greatest work. Kurosawa's dark, though tenderly hopeful humanist worldview found full expression in this run of films. He constructed worlds vivid and bleak, full of unforgiving violence, and when tales did not end in tragedy, it was because of characters who dared to stand in moral opposition to that world, pushing against it by making harrowing choices of sacrifice and selflessness, earning their dignity through struggle and perseverance. This period came to a climax in 1965 with Red Beard. Kurosawa's ambition and perfectionism were pushed to their absolute limit in this film. Production lasted 2 long years, and the attention to detail and historical accuracy was meticulous. Kurosawa constructed a full-sized town as his set. Buildings were made from the oldest available wood to suggest the town's age. Actors were asked to continuously wear and wash their costumes to give them properly aged looks. Cabinets and drawers were completely stocked with period-accurate props, even if they were never seen on camera. Not even the bedding escaped Kurosawa's attention. He had people sleeping on it for 6 months in advance to make everything look convincingly lived in. Red Beard ranks among the director's most demanding and rewarding films. A 3-hour drama, the story portrays a young medical student's slow spiritual growth from self-centered opportunist to dedicated humanitarian, under the stern tutelage of a wise doctor, brilliantly played by Toshiro Mifune. It's a perfect encapsulation of everything Kurosawa strove to communicate in his work: the strength of empathy, the difficulty of personal growth. By the end, we are left with the essential awareness that for our world to have any chance of improving, people must live their lives for more than themselves. Although Kurosawa's action pictures tended to be more successful overseas, in his homeland, according to Stuart Galbraith, in his incredible book, The Emperor and the Wolf, The Lives and Films of Akira Kurosawa and Toshiro Mifune, Red Beard was seen as something of a creative pinnacle, Kurosawa's crowning achievement. There was not much room left for him to ascend any higher within the Japanese industry, which was already in the first stages of a long decline. To continue making films at the scale he was accustomed, Kurosawa decided it was necessary to go into business with Hollywood. Kurosawa's influence was already being strongly felt in the West. Seven Samurai was remade as The Magnificent Seven in 1960. Rashomon was the basis for The Outrage in 1964, and that same year Sergio Leone used Yojimbo as the blueprint for A Fistful of Dollars, the movie responsible for pioneering what became known as the spaghetti western. More remakes and homages would follow in subsequent decades. Nearly the entire generation of new Hollywood directors would claim him as an influence, including Robert Altman, Francis Ford Coppola, Steven Spielberg, John Milius, and George Lucas, who famously drew elements from Kurosawa's work in creating his landmark Star Wars series. Kurosawa was aware of the interest from the West. Stuart Galbraith writes that the director, around the time of Red Beard, estimated he had received about 60 offers for film projects from Europe and the US, turning them all down to work on his own material. One offer came from actor Peter O'Toole and producer Joseph E. Levine for a film about Will Adams, one of the first Westerners to become a samurai. Adams's story would later inspire a popular book and miniseries titled Shogun. Kurosawa never accepted Levine's offer, but he would employ the producer's services a few years later, when he brought an idea of his own to Levine's Embassy Pictures. Japan's film industry was just then exiting a golden age of peak success and productivity. Box office numbers were dropping, and this downward trend would continue for quite a few years to come. As popular as Kurosawa was, it was getting difficult to raise budgets of the size needed for his projects. One place money was not in short supply was Hollywood. Joseph Levine was an independent producer and distributor with an impressive range of credits to his name: exploitation pictures, prestige pieces, Italian imports. He was even the one who helped introduce American audiences to Godzilla in 1956. He had worked with auteurs before on risky productions like Contempt with Jean-Luc Godard and The Graduate with Mike Nichols. He respected Kurosawa's genius and tried to give the director the same amount of control over his work that he was used to. Kurosawa was happy to be making his next film under these conditions. The film being made was Runaway Train, based off a 1963 Life magazine article by Warren R. Young. The script was written by Kurosawa and regular collaborators Hideo Oguni and Ryuzo Kikushima, with English translation by Sidney Carroll. Envisioned as a non-stop action thriller, the plot followed two escaped prisoners who hop aboard a locomotive that winds up malfunctioning and careening out of control through upstate New York. Kurosawa would shoot the film in color on 70mm, his first time working with both formats, on location in New York, possibly with American stars Lee Marvin and Henry Fonda in lead roles. The film entered production in 1966, budgeted at over $5 million, a modest sum for an American movie, but many times higher than anything Kurosawa had worked with previously, even on Red Beard. Runaway Train was being designed as a pure visual spectacle. Kurosawa wanted to film in the fall and winter to provide heavy snow that would contrast with the dark colors of the train. Brighter colors and primaries would be used sparingly as storytelling devices. The emphasis was on action and momentum. The story would be minimal, and the real star would be the train, which would not stop moving for the whole length of the picture. This was going to be a proper Hollywood debut, crafted with a kind of artistry only a director of Kurosawa's caliber could provide. Filming was scheduled to begin in the final months of 1966. Multiple delays, for reasons that were never totally made clear, possibly script trouble or budgetary issues, threw the production off track. Kurosawa was going to wait for the winter of 1967 to continue, but by then he was busy with another job. In April 1967, 20th Century Fox hired him to direct Tora, Tora, Tora. The film was being produced by Elmo Williams for studio head Daryl Zanuck and his son Richard. This team had earlier assembled The Longest Day, a massive hit centered on the Normandy invasion of 1944, which later inspired the opening sequence for Steven Spielberg's Saving Private Ryan. The Longest Day was unusual for a studio film. It was heavily researched, and made to be as historically accurate as possible. The producers actually hired multiple directors to tell the story from every side: American, British, French, and German. The cast featured actors of each nationality speaking their native languages for those sequences. This was a gamble for a movie as expensive as this, but it paid off. Tora was going to be their follow-up, this time focusing on the attack at Pearl Harbor. It was an even larger production than Longest Day, split essentially into two separate, full units. An American team that would tell half the story from an American perspective, and a Japanese team that would tell the Japanese side. Something like this had not really been attempted before in a Hollywood film. It was a huge offer, promising enormous exposure and an even bigger budget than Runaway Train. Kurosawa couldn't resist accepting it. He decided to suspend production on Runaway Train until Tora was completed. After suffering a series of expensive flops, 20th Century Fox was relying on the film to reverse their fortunes. Kurosawa poured himself into the research, again writing his script with Oguni and Kikushima. The screenplay took months to come together. Kurosawa obsessed over every single detail. When it was finished, it was over 400 pages long. Under Kurosawa's unconventional formatting, this was equivalent to about 4.5 hours of screen time, and that wasn't counting the American half. Severe cuts were made to this script, and Kurosawa struggled to adjust to American working methods. Concerns developed when the studio hired Richard Fleischer to direct the American sequences. Fleischer was a studio veteran whose output varied in quality, but he actually wasn't a bad director. He could handle large budgets, and later managed to put out solid genre work like Soylent Green and Conan the Destroyer. Understandably though, Kurosawa was anxious about how well his footage would cut together with Fleischer's, especially since he had apparently signed on thinking David Lean would be directing the picture's other half. Filming finally got underway at Toei Studios in December 1968. It was an unmitigated disaster. Stuart Galbraith recounts the production in depth in The Emperor and the Wolf. The troubles he describes are seemingly endless. Kurosawa was filming his half of the movie in Japan, but reporting back to production offices in Hollywood. This resulted in many communication difficulties. The American producers did not understand Kurosawa's working methods, and admittedly, he did make some puzzling choices. In many of the lead roles, as historical military figures, Kurosawa cast businessmen, company presidents and CEOs who had no acting experience whatsoever, but who must have projected something of the aura that Kurosawa wanted for the characters. He was also working with an entirely new crew. Kurosawa had spent years with a recurring team at Toho. He did his best work with people who knew him very well and anticipated his every need, allowing him to maintain the extreme concentration required for his methodical directing style. Building that same sense of trust and cohesion at Toei proved impossible. His new crew was immediately put off by the level of perfectionism he demanded, and Kurosawa repeatedly lost his temper. People were fired on an almost daily basis. Sets were painted and repainted to get the exact color shades he wanted. The stress involved with overseeing a production of this size and sculpting every last detail to his exacting standards stretched Kurosawa to the breaking point. He became bizarrely paranoid and was hospitalized several times. 20th Century Fox seriously started to worry that Kurosawa might be mentally ill. After about 22 days of filming, which resulted in just 7 or 8 minutes of usable footage, production was suspended, and by January 1969, Kurosawa was no longer directing the film. It was a humiliating blow for a filmmaker whose career, up to this point, had been an unstoppable series of triumphs. Kurosawa struggled to recover, and over the next few years his status as Japan's most illustrious director came crashing to the ground. Kurosawa's dismissal from Tora reads, at first, like another case of careless Hollywood mistreatment of a great auteur, But surprisingly, 20th Century Fox appears to have made a considerate effort to keep Kurosawa as their director. The studio initially appeared willing to give him time to rest before continuing his work, but miscommunication between Kurosawa's offices and the American producers was getting worse. In January 1969, Kurosawa sent a telegram to the studio saying that he was willing to pay for the completion of the film with his own money if it meant he could continue directing. In February, the studio sent Richard Zanuck to Japan to meet with Kurosawa about finishing the movie. Kurosawa didn't show up, apparently because he was not informed of the meeting until it was too late. It's not clear exactly what happened, but Stuart Galbraith writes that there was some suspicious activity involving the general manager of Kurosawa's company, Tetsu Aoyagi. Aoyagi was accused of withholding information and conspiring behind Kurosawa's back, all of which he fervently denied. It's possible Aoyagi just got caught in the crosshairs of a very messy situation. Kurosawa was definitely not in a healthy mental space. Galbraith reports that during production of Tora, the director seemingly became convinced he was being pursued by assassins, and that his safety was in imminent danger. After Aoyagi quit Kurosawa's company, he never worked in the film industry again. Tora was finished without Kurosawa's involvement, and Runaway Train was abandoned. Kinji Fukasaku and Toshio Masuda were hired as Kurosawa's replacements, the former to handle effect sequences, the latter to handle dialogue scenes. Both were solid directors and reliable journeymen, known for their speed and efficiency. Possible alternatives considered by the studio included Masaki Kobayashi, Kihachi Okamoto, Kon Ichikawa, Noboru Nakamura, and maybe even Toshiro Mifune. All of Kurosawa's footage was scrapped, the film was recast, and after going 3 times over its original budget, Tora was completed and released in September of 1970. The finished film is amazingly harmonious, considering all the production chaos, and contains some stunning effects work and aerial photography. The story is a bit dry. We never grow very attached to any of the characters, or develop an emotional investment in the plot, one of the drawbacks to a film that puts historical accuracy above drama. But the film does effectively convey a sense of foreboding doom. Tora was negatively received upon release, and underperformed at the box office, which further damaged the studio. By this time, American movie tastes were changing. Fox unexpectedly had a much bigger hit that year with Robert Altman's subversive war comedy, MASH, which had cost only a fraction of Tora and grossed more than twice as much at the box office. The new Hollywood was arriving. Runaway Train would eventually be made as well. 15 years later, in 1985, the script turned up in the hands of Cannon Films. Cannon was mostly known for low-budget 80s action movies and Chuck Norris vehicles, but their output also included independent dramas, like John G. Avildsen's Joe, John Cassavetes' Love Streams, and Jean-Luc Godard's memorably inexplicable King Lear. The script was heavily rewritten by George Milicevic, Paul Zindel, and crime writer Edward Bunker, perhaps best remembered as Mr. Blue in Reservoir Dogs. An opening prison sequence was added to include more backstory, the setting was changed to Alaska, there was now a human antagonist in the form of a crazed warden played by John P. Ryan, and at the end, we never actually see the train come to a stop. Jon Voight, Eric Roberts, and Rebecca De Mornay starred, with Andrei Konchalovsky, a Russian filmmaker who had worked on some of the early films of Andrei Tarkovsky, directing. The film is very campy, with every actor sneering, snarling, and shouting every last line of dialogue. A lofty strain of existential themes is inserted awkwardly, resulting in unintentional humor, like when De Mornay asks Voight's character, "What are you, an animal?" And he responds, "Worse, human. It also marked the acting debut of the great Danny Trejo. Somehow the film received very positive reviews upon release, even several Oscar nominations, and it maintains a strong cult following to this day. This might be due mainly to the film's technical achievements, which are impressive. Konchalovsky skillfully uses camera angles, editing, and sound design to suggest the train's presence as a menacing beast. This is the one thing that seems to carry over strongly from Kurosawa's original plan. The train is the real star. Kurosawa came out of Hollywood with his reputation in shambles. Arguably, his own working methods were at least partially to blame for this. His unshakable stubbornness and colossal perfectionism were not exactly compatible with an American studio mentality. It had earned him notoriety even before his Hollywood venture. The Japanese press had given him the nickname, the Emperor. Now that the Japanese industry was deep in recession and major studios were starting to declare bankruptcy, making films of the scale and artistry of Kurosawa's became next to impossible. In response, he formed his own company, with fellow directors Masaki Kobayashi, Kaisuke Kinoshita, and Kon Ichikawa, called the Club of the Four Knights. Together, they planned to produce each other's films, using the profits from one film to finance another. First up was Kurosawa, who delivered a rather strange and experimental piece called Dodeska Den. The story was episodic, portraying the tragic lives of residents of a junkyard slum. By Kurosawa's standards, it was filmed quickly and cheaply, without many of his usual collaborators, some of whom, like Toshiro Mifune, he would never work with again. Dodeska Den finally gave Kurosawa the chance to work with color film stock, and he designed the visuals to contrast imaginatively with the grim story. The film frequently looks more like a fairy tale than a realistic drama, and this suggests the hopefulness of the inner lives of the characters. The film is touching and beautiful, one of the more underrated works of Kurosawa's career. It failed on its initial release, and the Club of the Four Knights disbanded. It didn't look like Kurosawa would ever make another film. So, on December 22nd, 1971, he attempted to take his own life. Kurosawa cut himself with his razor 6 times across the throat and 8 times across his wrists, and would have bled to death if his maid hadn't discovered him in time. Kurosawa was always reluctant to discuss his personal life, but there is much evidence to suggest that he was a very haunted man. When he was 13, his older brother Haigo took him to view the devastation wrought by the Great Kanto earthquake of 1923. Kurosawa witnessed the horror of the disaster firsthand. When he tried to look away from the countless bodies, his brother forced him to hold his gaze. Young Kurosawa never forgot this experience. 10 years later, Haigo committed suicide. Enduring such traumas as this, not to mention the terror of the war years, probably left a lasting mark on Kurosawa. His workaholic tendencies and extreme perfectionism might have been a sort of coping mechanism, suppressing or perhaps channeling his emotional demons. When he lost his creative outlet, Kurosawa had difficulty functioning. According to Kurosawa's longtime assistant, Teruyo Nogami, in her wonderful book Waiting on the Weather, the years following Dodeska Den were incredibly difficult. Kurosawa received an offer from the Soviet Union to direct a film for them in 1973. He jumped at the chance to get back behind a camera. In 1975, he released Dersu Uzala, an epic period drama based on the life of a native hunter and his lasting friendship with a Russian officer, exploring the region he calls his home. It starts as a rugged adventure film, but the tone grows elegiac and somber. The ending is the saddest Kurosawa ever shot. The movie was made under severely challenging conditions in the Siberian wilderness. It was Kurosawa's only time working in the 70mm format, and the large equipment only added to the problems. Nogami remembers the director drinking heavily throughout the production. His behavior was erratic, and his temper was short. Dersu Uzala was likely the single most troubled production of his career, and it took an enormous toll on the then 65-year-old director. Although it was successful and won the Soviet government an Oscar for Best Foreign Language Film, Kurosawa's hopes for financing more Russian productions went unfulfilled. Throughout the late 70s, Kurosawa spent more time at home and grew closer to his family, which helped him recover. He continued working on scripts, writing Kagemusha, Ran, and an unmade adaptation of Edgar Allan Poe's The Masque of Red Death during this time. He assumed none of these films would ever be made, and tried to realize his visions instead as paintings. In 1978, astonished at Kurosawa's inability to raise funding, George Lucas and Francis Ford Coppola, two of the most powerful directors in Hollywood, set up a deal for Kurosawa at 20th Century Fox, coincidentally the same studio that had once hired him to direct Tora. This helped Kurosawa stage a defiantly grand career revival. Kagemusha was released in 1980, winning Kurosawa the Palme d'Or at Cannes. Ran followed in 1985, earning him an Oscar nomination for Best Director. Kurosawa was able to find support for these movies mainly in the West. French producer Serge Silberman, who helped make most of the last films of the great Spanish director Luis Buñuel, backed Ran, and Steven Spielberg was instrumental in securing Warner Brothers' support for the boldly unconventional Dreams. These movies, in particular Kagemusha and Ran, were the darkest and most despairing of Kurosawa's career. Their stories lament over the cruelty of fate, the pain of hubris, and the mindless destruction wrought by human pride and avarice. It's likely a reflection of the anger and depression that almost consumed the director at his lowest point in the early 70s. What's interesting, though, is that making these films seemed to restore some of his optimistic humanism. His last two movies, Rhapsody in August and Madadeo, made in the early 90s, when the director himself was approaching 90 years of age, were both gentle character pieces. Kurosawa made them with all the effortless skill a lifetime of movie making had taught him. The sweetness of these movies suggests that in spite of all his hardship, he was grateful to still be alive and still making films. He would have made more if he'd been able. In his final years, Kurosawa was working on The Sea is Watching. The story took place in a brothel overlooking the sea, and revolved around the day-to-day lives of sex workers in the 18th century. It would have climaxed with a dramatic flood sequence. When it looked like the film might be too expensive, Kurosawa started work on a more modest screenplay called After the Rain. His health started declining in 1995, and the final act came to a close in 1998. Kurosawa passed away at the age of 88. Both of his last projects were completed after his death. Takashi Koizumi filmed After the Rain in 1999, and Kei Kumai made The Sea is Watching in 2002. There's no question that Kurosawa could be a difficult man to work for. Even so, he was a great artist. His films contributed so much to the history of Japanese and world cinema. The negative impact of his mid-career failures and professional missteps seemed far more than he deserved. I think there's a larger lesson to be learned here. No matter what anyone may or may not deserve, life usually has other plans. Kurosawa suffered great misfortune, but in a lot of ways, he was lucky. He could have died in that suicide attempt. He could have turned his back entirely on the film industry and never made another film. He didn't. He lived, and he kept working. When the industry no longer supported him, his fellow artists stepped in to lend a helping hand. Kurosawa gave everything to his filmmaking. Through his films, he gave to the world. When he needed it, the world gave something back. That doesn't always happen, but if we give up hope, then it never happens at all. I think in some way, Kurosawa knew how lucky he was. He got to leave behind a priceless body of work, and today, we are lucky that it remains with us.